Now, many of you have already been posing questions, which actually, there's, I would say, very influential scholars and very smart people across social sciences have tried to address. What is the impact of colonization? Actually, we zoom in Africa and various parts of Africa, but the same question could be posed, for example, about Latin America, about India, about many other parts. Now, as it will become clear in the next 2-3 weeks, actually tackling this question from an economics viewpoint is actually quite challenging because it's very hard to come up with a reasonable counterfactual. So how can we think about the world economy in the 17th to the early 20th century as having not this significant effect of colonization? True, we can find some places, for example, in Ethiopia and Liberia, where colonization was much shorter, or perhaps it was not even existent. But again, few will question that those two countries were immune, if you like, to imperialism, as it was coined at the time. And of course, to come up with a counterfactual, with the answer to the counterfactual, we need to come up with a story of how African states that we discussed in lecture 2 and lecture 3 would have evolved in the absence of colonization. And actually, some influential scholars have argued that colonization was extremely deleterious to Africa because it hit at a time when we had the emergence of strong and somewhat efficient African states. An important caveat that we have already seen is that we tend to discuss a lot about colonization, but actually in the preceding to African colonization period, we saw that Africa suffered deeply from the African slave trades. So actually the influence of Europeans and imperial powers to Africa actually precedes colonization, at least in the case of Africa. Now, the way that economics research has tried to come up with this issue, as it will become clearer with Leonard and our guests in the following weeks, is effectively during colonization, many things happen in Africa. And again, we will zoom here on Africa, but the same kind of discussion would apply had we studied colonization in Latin America or elsewhere. First of all, we had very extractive institutional arrangement, forced labor, slavery, a lot of oppression, colonial violence, native or indirect rule in some parts and not in others. Well, at the same time, the imperial powers did build some roads and railroads and a bit some ports, so there was some infrastructure development, actually quite less, much less actually than what people had anticipated at the time. As Leonard will discuss later, there were some human capital investments, a build-up of schools, of some primary health facilities. Of course, a huge influence of colonization on the trajectory of African countries' economic development has been what has been coined as dependency, in the sense that African countries specialized in some goods that European powers were in need at the time, and perhaps there was significant inertia on that. Of course, the politics and the political economy, the economic power altered during the colonial times and actually in the preceding slave trades period, and these had lasting impacts on the continent. So effectively, economics research has been trying to come up and study those features kind of in isolation, but at the same time, studying also perhaps heterogeneous effects, let's say, of Christian missionary schools or railroads and roads or ports. And heterogeneity could be across place, across religious affiliation, ethnic groups, rural, urban, many other aspects. And of course, the research that we will cover has focused on all main periods of colonization, although I think it's fair to say that most of economic research has been on the early colonial period. We have not seen much work actually on late colonial period. Actually, Leonard, in a couple of weeks, will discuss some very fascinating work he has on the type of independence movements and their impact on subsequent political development in Africa. So let me now take 5 minutes or perhaps 7 minutes, and discuss an extremely influential conjecture put forward by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, I would say now 20 years ago, that in some sense, alongside the work of Laporta, Lopez de Encilán, Schleifer, and Wisny, set the seeds and put fertilizer, if you like, to a younger generation of economists that took those ideas into a much more micro and causal identification kind of viewpoint. So Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson effectively put forward the following idea about the role of colonization in explaining nowadays large differences in economic development. If you recall from lecture one, Nathan Nunn mentioned that if you take the richest to poorest country nowadays, even if you drop outliers, some small countries that do phenomenally well or not so well, we talk about differences in the range of 25, even 30 to 1. If one was to go back in time and go in the beginning of the colonial times, those differences were 3 to 1, 4 to 1, clearly way smaller than what we observed. So effectively, Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson thought that something must have happened during this time, the Great Divergence period, and colonization was actually, what clearly impacted both Europe, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and many parts of the world. So if I was to provide a schematic representation, this would be as follows. In some parts of the world, Europeans were very extractive. And in some other parts of the world, European imperial powers were less extractive. When we say inclusive here, everything has to be thought through the lens of the pervasive ideology at the time. So we had a spectrum of very extractive colonies and not so much extractive colonies. Now, those institutions that Europeans set up during colonization also shaped political power during colonization. So then we have independence in Latin America in 1820s, 1830s, in Africa a century later, in India after World War II. But those institutions, and especially the distribution of economic and political power, persisted. And because of this persistence, what happened in the colonial times matters for today, for the institutions today. Think about the quality of the bureaucracy, how corrupt or honest administrators are, how efficient courts are, regulatory capacity, investor protection, shareholders' rights, creditors' rights, and more. And through this mechanism, we see nowadays large differences in economic development across the world. Of course, the next question is why on earth, in some places, Europeans applied strategy A, and in some other parts of the world, Europeans applied strategy B, and in some other places, a hybrid of A or B. So the next step of their conjecture was that the living conditions that Europeans faced in other parts of the world where they migrated en masse actually was a crucial feature. The disease environment, opposition from the locals, various other geographic or ecological kind of conditions, those were key driving forces of the type of colonization and the size of European settlements. Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson compiled some data on settler mortality using newspaper information at the time, and they effectively revealed as a first set of results that in those places where settler mortality was high for Europeans, in those places you have relatively weak institutions today. This is in 2000, but the same would apply today. While conversely, in places where it was easy for Europeans to migrate because their mortality rates were low, actually today you see high levels of institutional capacity here as proxied in a composite rule of law index. The same applies with GDP. So in places where you had high levels of mortality rates, you have, relatively speaking, economic underdevelopment as reflected with GDP. And conversely, in places with low settler mortality, high levels of economic development. Of national institutions that reflect the colonial strategy, settler mortality or population density is a strong correlate of economic development. So this effectively is there three kind of results. So what can we take now out of it? This work has been massively criticized on various grounds, but taking a constructive viewpoint is that we can take as given that the strategies of the imperial powers were clearly different. From an economist viewpoint, it kind of makes sense that geological, ecological, geographic features matter, in the sense that the colonial strategy was not a random event. It was driven by some economic kind of consideration. And then we have also a very interesting story connecting the past to today. And this comes through the role of political power and economic power that appears very, very much persistent. We will discuss, for example, later in the lecture, a fascinating follow-up study by Daron Acemoglu, Jim Robinson, and Tristan Reed, showing in the case of Sierra Leone, they go into the micro and they trace the development and evolution of political power, showing strong inertia from the time of British rule up until today.